Warm greetings from cold and snowy Arlington, Virginia. My name is Sherry Mueller, and it's my privilege to welcome each of you on behalf of the Public Diplomacy Council of America to this first Monday Forum in 2025, featuring Professor Joseph Nye. It's also an opportune time to express heartfelt thanks to all of you who actively support PDCA, whether it's through sharing your expertise and mentoring Davis Fellows and rising professionals, whether it's serving on committees or producing our wonderful PDCA weekly update, or whether it's paying dues promptly and making financial contributions. We're grateful that so many of you are actively supporting us. Also want to say, for those of you, and more than 300 people registered for this session, for those of you who are not yet members of PDCA, you are cordially invited to join. I also want to say a special thank you to our co-sponsors today, the University of Southern California Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, as well as the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications, as well as to our other partner organizations. After I briefly interview Professor Nye, PDCA members Karen Gladbach and Bill Wanland will each pose a question on screen, followed by your questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box and reserve the chat box for any technical issues you may have. Gabby Stahl, PDCA Hans Tom Tuck Graduate Fellow, will serve as our primary tech host today. She'll be monitoring your questions and also posing them to Professor Nye. Marcy Falk-Bedos, rising professional member of PDCA, as well as a former Tuck Fellow, will serve as a backup tech host, and she also has the honor of introducing Professor Nye. Over to you, Marcy.
Thank you, Sherry. So today we are joined by Dr. Joseph S. Nye, one of the most distinguished global thinkers and political scientists in the field of international relations in the last 60 years. He was the first writer to use and coin the term soft power beginning in 1990, and his arguments have helped legions of scholars and practitioners sharpen their focus on what makes public diplomacy different from other forms of diplomacy. Professor Nye is a University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He received his bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Princeton University, won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard. He has worked in 3 government agencies where he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. Dr. Nye has served on a plethora of nonprofit boards, has received a multitude of awards and titles, and has written so many books, all of which I cannot name, as I would be going well over my time limit for introducing Dr. Nye. I am personally excited to be here because I have had the wonderful opportunity to read several of his works in graduate school at American University's School of International Service. Some of the titles that I have had the pleasure of reading include, but are not limited to, Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics, Smart Power, The Powers to Lead, and his most recent book, A Life in the American Century. The latter 2 I currently have in my hands as we speak. His latest book is a memoir where Dr. Nye shares his own journey living through what he deems the American century, a period during which the U.S. has enjoyed unrivaled power, be it political, economic, or military, on the global stage. Thank you, Dr. Nye, for joining us here today. Sherry, back to you.
Marcy, thanks so much. Professor Nye, heartfelt thanks for being here today. As Marcy noted, you wrote The Changing Nature of American Power back in 1990 and first used the term soft power then, which has found its way into our culture Um, we've talked about the musical soft power. In the 35 years since you first used that term, how have your views about soft power evolved?
Well, thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Marcy, for the generous introduction. Um, when I developed power, there was a widespread belief that the United States was in decline. Paul Kennedy's famous book on the rise and fall of the great powers was a New York Times bestseller. I didn't think that was quite right, and after I totaled up American military power and American economic power, it seemed to me there was still something missing. And that was our ability to attract, to get others to do what they otherwise wouldn't do because they were attracted rather than coerced or paid. So that gave rise to the term. I still think the term makes sense, the way it was originally phrased. But my major concern since then is that somehow people assume that soft power could replace hard power. And that wasn't my intent. My intent was to say that if you consider only hard power, military and economic power, you're missing something. But I didn't intend to say you can turn entirely to soft power. So my major change over the time that you mentioned would not be in the basic definition, but in the making sure that people realize that it was not intended as a replacement. That's why I developed this term smart power, which is the ability to combine hard and soft power in a way in which they don't cancel each other out, but reinforce each other. But soft power is originally defined, I think, is still pretty much the same idea. The power to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment.
People don't typically associate soft, um, or the term soft, I guess, with strength, especially in today's contentious politically fraught environment. If you were writing about it now or naming it, would you still stay with the term soft? And if I could sneak one other thing on it, I've heard you talk about the pillars of soft power. Um, if you could embroider a little bit on that, please.
Well, I would still use the term. Some of my critics have said the problem with soft power is that it's soft. And my reply to that is depends on the time horizon you take. In the very short run, if I want to steal your money, I can pull out a gun, shoot you, and take your wallet, and I have it immediately. But if I want to steal your money through soft power by persuading you that I'm a guru and you should give it to me, usually takes more time. But to be more serious and think of examples, Stalin used to say, how many divisions does the Pope have? Note that today there's still a papacy, and though you could argue that Putin is a miniature Stalin. But the point is that both hard and soft power are important. I think the pillars or the resources that essentially provide the basis for attraction are a country's own values, domestic values, and how well it practices them, and also its foreign policy, whether it is one which sort of attests or helps others as opposed to being extraordinarily self-centered. And that's where public diplomacy comes in. I mean, if you can express your values in a foreign policy which is attractive to others, then you don't have to spend as much on carrots and sticks.
Um, we're talking about the term public diplomacy, and there are various definitions. One of my other heroes in this field, Leonard Baldiga, defines public diplomacy as a government's effort to impact public opinion and ultimately public policy abroad. Can you give some more examples where public diplomacy and soft power intersect? Maybe even from your own career where you saw that happen.
Well, public diplomacy is important as a way for a government to get its message out to people in other countries, not just to other governments, but to publics. But it's also worth remembering that public diplomacy is not the only source of soft power. A great deal of a country's attraction comes from its civil society, not just from its government actions. And, I've sometimes argued that to understand American soft power, you have to look at the role of everything from Harvard to Hollywood, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the various aspects of our culture which can attract others. Smart public diplomacy doesn't interfere with those virtues. It plays them up, but it doesn't try to control them. The danger is if a government's public diplomacy becomes seen as manipulative or pure propaganda, it no longer attracts. So I think it's important to realize that a lot of our attraction, our soft power, comes from our civil society. And it's true that the government support that, but not get in its way.
Thank you. Marcy referred to your new memoir, A Life in the American Century. It's beautifully written, and I highly recommend it. And she also mentioned that you were chosen to be a Rhodes Scholar, and I wanted to ask you how that study abroad experience impacted your life and career.
Oh, it made a huge difference, as I try to describe in the memoir. I sometimes summarize, I'm a victim of power, but the idea of the Rhodes scholarships was to get people to study together, work together at Oxford University, where Rhodes had been an undergraduate, and to develop the bonds and friendships that could later serve to unite them in public life. So I found that those early experiences in England gave me a strong interest in things out our American boundaries. In fact, one of the uh, college mates I had at Oxford was a man from Ghana who was he was talking about at that time about how Africa was going to develop new forms of government, new forms of democracy, and we talked long into the nights about that. So when it came time to do my PhD, I basically wanted to do it in Africa, and I did. We lived in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania for a year and a half, and I attribute that to the fact that my friend Kwamina had stimulated that interest when I was at Oxford.
Fascinating. Um, Given the fact that today is January 6th, and we go back in our minds to 4 years ago, and of course, today is historic, and it's besides the fact that you're here with us at PDCA, it's historic because of what's going on Capitol Hill. What is your advice to the new administration about how to strengthen and best utilize US soft power?
Well, again, the extent to which we practice our democratic values, we attract others, or when we talk about our democratic values but don't practice them, then we undercut our soft power. So I think January 6th, 2020 was a threat to our soft power because it meant it looked like we weren't practicing the peaceful transition of power that we promised in our democracy. Um, the fact that January 6th, 2025 is a peaceful transition of power and that Kamala Harris will preside over the transition related to an election that she lost, that has a certain attraction to others without our having to make a big fuss about it. So, if the short form of that is saying when you practice what you preach, you have more attraction than when you just preach. And when you do preach, it's important to do so in a manner that incorporates the interests of others. I worry a little bit about the phrase like America first, not because it puts America first. Every politician in a democracy has to think of their national interest first, but it assumes that others are second, third, and fourth. And I think there are some areas where there are international public goods which can benefit us, but benefit others as well. And I would urge the administration to stress those aspects as well as those that are narrower versions of our national interest.
Professor Nye, this will be my last question before I turn it over to Karen Gladbach. And in various fora, I've seen you express real appreciation for US government exchange programs. For example, the International Visitor Leadership Program sponsored by our State Department, which will be celebrating its 85th anniversary this year. If you were describing the value of these programs to appropriators on Capitol Hill, what would be perhaps your message?
Well, I think the general message would be that if you can get young people as they approach leadership to interact with each other and understand each other, and in some cases make real friendships, that can have a strong impact on your foreign policy and attraction to others. And if the committee chair said, oh, that's all very well and good, but it's just verbiage, I say, okay, here is a set of numbers of the number of people who have been leaders of their countries and have also been part of our visitors program. It's quite extraordinary. I don't have them readily at hand. You probably do, but there's just an amazing number of leaders who have spent time on these visitor programs. I regard it as a very good in return on our investment.
Good, great. I'm going to ask Karen Gladbach to ask the next question on screen. Karen, thanks so much. I know you're in St. Louis despite the background.
Yes. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Professor Nye. As Marcy had said, it's really an honor to have you with us today. And I appreciate this opportunity to ask you a question. As a parent of actually young adults, my son just graduated from college. I'm really interested in the future of public diplomacy and how we can build soft power capacity in the next generation. And I'm also thinking about how can we encourage schools to incorporate this concept and skills into their curriculum starting at an earlier age.
Well, I think you even at an early age, you can explain to kids that we don't power is the ability to get others to do the things that we want them to do. And we don't run around hitting each other over the head to do that. Sometimes they do if you watch a first grade class. But more often than not, we are basically trying to attract others to do what they want. And it's essential in a democracy that we used attraction more than coercion or payment. Now, obviously, as I mean when I use the term smart power, you can't avoid coercion. I mean, the police play a very important role for deviant behavior and so forth. But understanding the importance of attraction is something that can be taught at a pretty early age. And I mean, I think probably most of us are doing it without even realizing it. It's like a little bit like Moliere's comment that people are speaking prose before they realize that it was prose. And it's what we do in parenting is getting children to attract others. And part of that is by realizing the interests of others and trying to adjust our ability to the and our interests to the interests of others. That's a very basic approach, but there's no reason you can't start that either in primary school or in secondary or in universities. Obviously, when you get to the university level, you're going to be trying to explain to people, if you're interested in international affairs, what are the mechanisms in which you do this. But I would hope that there'll be more young people who will actually think of themselves as practitioners of soft power, part of them by working in the government in public diplomacy, part of them by working for American foundations or overseas university groups or nonprofits and so forth. And I find that a number of my Kennedy School students are actually following that path.
Thank you.
Bill, I know you're in Panama, and it was Professor Nye, it was Bill's idea, which we all heartily embrace, to invite you for today's First Monday Forum. Bill Wanland, your turn, and from there, Gabby, you'll pick up on the questions from our audience. Bill Wanland, on the board of PDCA and writes for our weekly update. Bill?
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you, especially Professor Nye. It's very nice to see you again. And we're honored, of course, as we've been saying, that you're with us today. I'd like to talk to you about a particular aspect, particular time in your career, and that is when you were working with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, when you were invited, about 20 years ago, to explain the concept of soft power to ministry officials. Now, do you see any evidence that they've successfully incorporated it into their overall diplomatic playbook?
Well, the Chinese became interested in soft power as their overall power grew. In 2007, Hu Jintao, who's then the head of the Communist Party and president of China, told the 17th Party Congress that China had to increase its soft power. That was actually quite a shock to me, that an analytical term that I'd scribbled out yellow pads at our kitchen table while I was writing the book would come out of the mouth of the president of China. But China's had a hard time implementing its soft power. A good deal of attraction from its traditional culture, which is, of course, very attractive. It also gets a good deal of attraction out of its economic success. I mean, it has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but it limits itself in terms of its ability to attract others by two major problems. One is it has border conflicts with many of its neighbors, so it's hard to become attractive in New Delhi, for example, by establishing a Confucius Institute, if at the same time the news reports are full of the argument or descriptions of Chinese killing Indians in the Himalayan border. And the fact that China has several border disputes in Asia, I think, sets limits on their soft power there. The other big drawback they have is they want tight party control of civil society. And when you have too tight a party control of civil society, then you deprive yourself of those spontaneous elements that I mentioned earlier that produce attraction. So you develop a genius like Ai Weiwei, and you throw them in jail or exile them. That's not the way to make yourself attractive in Europe or Latin America or United States. So when I met with the foreign minister, and he asked for my advice, I said, ease up on tight party control and basically try to solve some of your border conflicts with your neighbors. I think my advice to him was accurate but totally useless.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. I'm now going to be opening up the Q&A from the audience. So again, please place your questions in the Q&A box if you want me to ask them to Professor Nye today. So Professor Nye, our first one here is from Carl Stoltz, a recently retired FSO. Professor Nye, since the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attacks on Israel and subsequent Israeli reactions, there was a sense of defeatism at many posts, with ambassadors and PIOs disengaging from media and public audiences because of the widespread criticism of the US and the West, and the rejection of further soft power. I sense this same attitude is spreading globally among FSOs and embassy country teams, fearing to engage with overseas audiences, especially in this time of the unpredictable Trump administration. What do you recommend we do to reverse the epidemic of disengagement?
Well, at the government level, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the new administration is less interested in soft power than it ought to be. So that makes the job of the FSOs more difficult. But if they think of the fact that that American values can still have important impact on others, even if the government policies are not popular, it means the job that they're doing remains important. I am always reminded of the fact that during the Vietnam War, American government policy was wildly unpopular around the world, and people were marching through the streets to basically protest American policies in Vietnam. But the interesting thing, of course, was that the protesters weren't singing the Communist Internationale. They were singing Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. So an anthem from American civil society meant that the extent to which we actually were practicing democracy, which was illustrated by the progress in the civil rights movement, made us attractive in government policies, which do. And so I think I've always been impressed by the quality and dedication of FSOs. And I would say, keep your spirits up because we need you.
Okay, great, thank you. So our next question is from Bruce Gregory, I think one of the Hall of Famers of the field of public diplomacy. He first starts out with a few quotes of yours, firstly regarding the paradox of the plenty from the paradox of American power. A plenitude of information leads to a poverty of attention, making attention rather than information the scarce resource. He has another quote, the future of power, from your book, obviously, and it discusses the power diffusion and cyber power. Decentralizing effects of computer power have outweighed their centralizing effects. Bruce wants to know, what would you add or subtract from these ideas in the context of today's artificial intelligence? Does AI have potential to significantly affect the logic of these assertions in diplomatic practice?
Well, those are great questions, Bruce, and I wish I had full answers. But or generative AI is new enough that we don't fully understand its implications. But it accelerates the trend that we've seen since the widespread use of the internet, and particularly the social media, which is this diffusion of information and the confusion that it creates among audiences. AI is simply going to make that even more readily available to more actors. So if you think of a world of hackers putting out misleading information, that's bad. But if you think of a world of bots um, putting out misleading information, there's no end to them. And that then puts a greater premium on how we differentiate our messages and how we weed out some of these worst aspects that AI is making possible. It's not going to be easy. There are questions of whether legislation can affect it. There's legislation in some states now, for example, about deep fakes to prevent the misuse of photographs of young people being combined, for example, with pornographic images. Um, I mean, there are particular legal areas which you can think of working on, but the larger question of how do you prevent this deterioration of trust in public communications when AI can do it all automatically, I think is a tough one. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you. So building a little bit on this, we have a question from Yu Yang Tang, and this is going a little bit more on the global scale. Do you think AI will redefine the balance of smart power by giving technologically advanced nations a disproportionate advantage in both soft and hard power domains?
Well, again, a very interesting and important question, and all I can do at this stage is speculate about it. Um, I'm a co-chair or have been co-chair of a group called the Aspen Strategy Group that meets every summer to try to think about new challenges to American security. I co-chair it with Condoleezza Rice. And last summer, we spent our week in Aspen on exactly this subject, which is how are we going to deal with AI in the national security sense? And that's why I'm a bit cautious of providing instant answers, because what we learned from that is that we have to do something, but it's going to be more complex than we first think. But I think the um, the AI can be used positively as well as negatively. It can be used to sort out enormous amounts of information. When you're looking at incoming flows of information, which you suspect of being manipulated, AI can help you distinguish between some of those and counter some of them. So it's going to be the typical cat and mouse interaction, and we should be prepared for that. It does mean that some of the mechanisms we've used in the past, while important, are not going to have the scope and scale and speed to meet the challenge that's produced by AI. But that brings me back to the question that we talked about earlier about person-to-person contact and visitors programs. Those are slow. Takes, somebody comes to visit, it's several weeks. If they're a student, it might be several years. But the quality of the interaction and how students or people think of others of that nationality lasts for a longer time. So it might be paradoxically that in a world in which you have this enormous acceleration in speed and broadening of scope of information, that some of the old traditional face-to-face interactions that are part of public diplomacy may become more important, not less important.
Great, thank you. So we have a question for one of our PDCA Rising professionals, Julong Wang. He asks, how can civil society and governments collaborate effectively to strengthen soft power initiatives, particularly in fostering trust and mutual understanding between nations on public and government levels?
Well, I think that there are do's and don'ts. The don'ts is don't try to micromanage civil society. In other words, the extent to which politicians censor certain expressions makes those expressions less credible, and that's hard to get across to a politician who is saying, "Why should I pay for an art exhibit promoted by the U.S. government when it includes pictures of the American flag upside down and distorted running colors?" They might say, "Oh my God, we can't the government can't be promoting something like that." But it's worth remembering an incident that I described in one of my books in the 1960s, 70s. There was a film called 12 Angry Men, which was about distortions and disruptions of the trial by jury system in the United States. And it was one of the few American films that the Soviets allowed to be played in Russia or in the Soviet Union. And ironically, one of the effects of that was not what the Soviets intended. It was to show how corrupt the Americans were. Many Russians said, "My God, if they'll let a film like this be made, they must be free." So don't micromanage civil society, even though sometimes it's awkward. And that's on the don'ts. On the do side, I'll take us back to this idea that promoting programs where you have real interactions which lead to real communications can be increasingly important rather than decreasingly so in a world where we're swamped by information, much of which we don't trust. So those would be my major do's and don'ts.
Great, thank you. So in our Q&A, we have a few questions asking about cultural diplomacy. And I think this one posed by Julie Moyes, who works on our newsletter, sums it up. She says, as a practitioner and as a former teacher of cultural affairs at the State Department, I have found sports and arts are extremely attractive to young audiences overseas because it's non-controversial and you don't need the English language. What are your views on using things like dance, music, and sports in PD? There are many skeptics of this type of soft power. And I want to add, if you do think these are of some use, how can we provide or create tangible evaluations to prove their worth? Sorry to add the little extra.
Yeah, no, I strongly disagree with the skeptics. I think those types of interaction, which are not obviously not governmentally controlled and are not propagandistic, those are extremely important in terms of conveying attraction. To go back to my Vietnam example, the fact that we were producing in the 60s not just policies which were wrong-headed on Vietnam, but also a great cultural change, which we saw in civil rights, in the role of women, and so forth, and that much of this came out in art and music and was expressed in various exchanges. That's extremely important, and I think it's crucial. It's one of our strong suits, and I think it's really important that we continue it.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned this earlier in your discussion with Sherry, the seeming paradox between the America First philosophy that is coming in with the new administration and the concept of soft power. Ambassador Brian Carlson asks, how would you reconcile these differences and try to empower the new administration to strengthen public diplomacy and soft power?
Well, remember that attraction comes partly from what the government says and does, and I would urge the new administration, if you use America First as a slogan at home to win votes, remember it probably doesn't win you many votes abroad. So be careful how you express your foreign policy, but also think of areas where you can see and share common interests and express those. That's I think another general kind of advice that one would give. In addition to that, I think be aware that a lot of what others to the United States is our technology, our openness, our universities, and don't interfere with them. I mean, promote them in a positive sense. Don't try to channel them or curtail them, and let America be America, so to speak, and don't overly narrow the picture of America. Um, you'll find that a great deal of attraction rests in aspects of our society that the government cannot control in a democracy and should not try to control.
Thank you. To move a little bit in a different direction, in wake of the recent passing of former President Carter, we have a few people asking about your time with President Carter, because I know that you worked with him on policy of non-proliferation. Joe Johnson, our board member, asks, what was President Carter's effect on U.S. soft power?
Well, Jimmy Carter was a quite an extraordinary man, as I say in the memoir. Many people thought he was not a successful president, or at least not a successful foreign policy president. And what I said in the is that if I were a historian investing in the stock of Carter, I would expect it to rise with time. And I think that's what has happened. But if you go back to Carter and human rights, he was quite extraordinary in terms of the emphasis which he put on human rights, and it had a lot of appeal and effect well beyond where people realized at the time. In about 1991 or two or so, I went to uh, Buenos Aires, and I met with a number of people who were in the government then. And my previous trip to Buenos Aires had been when I was with Secretary Vance during the Carter administration. And at that time, we, the visiting American delegation, were wildly unpopular since Carter was putting strong pressure on Argentina about human rights. And when I went back in 91 or 2, the Americans were very popular. And I asked one of my Argentine interlocutors why. He said, because when you were getting criticism from the government, they were pulling out our fingernails, and we haven't forgotten that. So Jimmy Carter's effects will be with us for quite some time, and I think that he was very good for our soft power.
To expand a little bit on your expertise under the Carter administration in nuclear non-proliferation, Bill Clifford asks, how do you view the threats and challenges of nuclear weapons for U.S. policy in today's international security environment?
Well, the nuclear problem is not new, but it is something we're going to have to keep on top of. I mean, it's interesting when Jack Kennedy was president, he expected there would be 20 to 25 countries with nuclear weapons by the 1970s. Carter put a strong priority on slowing the number of or the spread of nuclear weapons, and the number of countries with nuclear weapons today is 9. And I think when Carter was president, it was the openly nuclear countries were 7. So the spread hasn't been nearly as bad as Kennedy expected. But you have to be careful about tripping points. If, for example, Iran goes nuclear, that's going to put strong pressure on Saudi Arabia to follow suit. And you'll have a very different situation in the Persian Gulf if you have a rapid expansion of nuclear capacity. So a non-proliferation policy remains important. I think Carter was wise to put the emphasis that he did on it, and I think his actions helped to slow things down somewhat. But we can't afford to let up on this.
Mhm. We have talked a little bit about some of the actors on the US side that play into our development of soft power. Joan Mower asks, how does the US Agency for Global Media fit into this new communications environment? Has it become obsolete?
Well, it would be obsolete if we allowed it to become a simplistic government mouthpiece. Then it would simply be another voice, which would be in this plethora of information channels, but one which was not trusted. I think if you think back on the reputation of the Voice of America, it was able to maintain itself with a fair degree of credibility because it was able to bite the hand that feeds it. It was able to be critical. And the fact that you had VOA journalists who were willing and able to be critical of American government and society meant that it was, I think, an important part of our public diplomacy, and I think that remains so. If the current emphasis on the uh, organization of media leads to increased government control or censorship, then I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Dr. Atim George. As we grapple with the current challenges of the climate crisis, how can we, as the US, leverage public diplomacy in engaging international partners and efforts to address this issue?
Well, first of all, don't withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord again, but I may be whistling into the wind on that. But it's clear that calling climate change a hoax, as President Trump did, doesn't enhance our reputation with other countries, which realize that the science is real. On the other hand, there are aspects of our society at the state and local level where people are taking climate change seriously, as as well as in various foundation works and nonprofits. So the government is not the only actor on climate change, and to strengthen and encourage those private actions. Government side, I think the fact that the Biden administration did make some major investments in climate through the Inflation Reduction Act has meant that we're doing somewhat better than might otherwise be the case in terms of renewables energy sources. The press is predicting that President Trump will reduce the subsidies for solar and for electric vehicles. That may be, but some of the trends that are accentuating increase of renewables are going to persist anyway. When one looks at the price of solar energy, what's important is how impressively it has come down over the years. So, whatever the new administration says, we can be discouraged, but not so discouraged that we forget that underneath it there is progress, and we want to work with other countries to try and encourage.
Moving on to a different form of diplomacy that I've at least seen on the rise, we have a question about entrepreneurship diplomacy. How do you see the role of entrepreneurship diplomacy as soft power to support the economic sustainable development of the emerging and developing markets, especially in Africa?
Oh, I think it's tremendously important. I mean, the extent to which we were able to encourage entrepreneurship and to create links between Americans and new African entrepreneurs, whether it be through governmental means or through nonprofits, or whether it be through corporations. All these are, I think, very important. As I mentioned earlier, I started my academic career working in East Africa, and there is an enormous potential there, and we ought to think of all the ways government, private foundations, nonprofits, and so forth to try to stimulate African entrepreneurship and assist it.
All right. And we have quite a few questions about the soft power efforts done by countries such as Russia, the PRC, and Iran. How would you evaluate their current public diplomacy measures, especially as countries highly criticized for its own reputation and policies?
Well, Russia, I think does not have much soft power. Let me qualify that by saying that in the parts of the former Soviet Union where there are Russian-speaking populations and where there are still ties to Russian institutions and the Russian market, there is a degree of soft power. But if you look at Russian soft power in Europe, in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, it's close to nil. I mean, there are a few pro-Russian politicians in Hungary or Czech Republic, but there's not a lot of Russian soft power. If you look at China, it's a more mixed bag. I mean, China, as I mentioned, has the problems of border disputes and overly tight party control, which limit its soft power. But it also has the virtues that I mentioned earlier of its traditional culture, which it expresses through its Confucius institutes and its Belt and Road Initiative, which is like a major aid program for infrastructure. And so I think China has more soft power. If you look at recent public opinion polls by Pew Charitable Trust or by Gallup, you'll see that the United States is regarded as more attractive than China in all continents except Africa, where the U.S. and China are roughly tied. I mean, both of them have a relative degree of attraction. The extent to which China misuses its Belt and Road Initiative, it can undercut its own soft power. I mean, the extent to which borrowing countries fall into what's called a debt trap, and the extent to which China is not joining with other countries in the Paris Club of forgiving bad loans, this hurts China. And some of the benefits that it gets from its aid program, BRI, are limited by this. But nonetheless, China does get some soft power from BRI, as well as from its traditional culture and from its overall economic success, as I mentioned earlier.
So, discussing all of these states that we see as adversaries today and their current use of disinformation and soft power, as you just discussed, had me thinking a little bit back to the Cold War, not to make a comparison between it, but it reminds me and made me think of another question brought up by William Courtney about USIA and maybe reflecting on that. Has the merger of USIA into state affected the quality or effectiveness of US public diplomacy?
Well, Bill knows the answer to that even better than I do from his experience. I think it was a terrible decision. I think USIA had its own esprit de corps, its own impressive people that were working there, and I think wrapping it into the State Department as an undersecretaryship deprived it of some of the independence that it had before. So it was a political compromise in the 90s. I guess it was Senator Helms who was pushing behind it. And I'm just sorry that the Clinton administration agreed to it. But I think if we could reverse it, I would reverse it. If you ask me what are the probabilities that will reverse it, I'd say slim to none.
Okay, thank you. And I am going to ask our last question. I apologize to those that we couldn't get to today, but thank you all for all the wonderful questions. I thought this one could leave us on hopefully a little bit of a hopeful note. This is from Joseph Murphy. You've talked a lot about the importance of face-to-face interactions. I recently walked past a group of 20 middle school students waiting for the school bus, and there was total silence. No one was talking. Everyone had their heads down, focused on their smartphones. Is the future effectiveness of face-to-face diplomacy at risk, or am I just being old?
Well, you and I are both old. When I look at my grandchildren, I keep saying to them, there are other things besides your phone and social media. But with that said, I think that there are two things. One is to arrange more opportunities for face-to-face interactions, and the other is to think of how we use social media to get children or young people to expand their horizons. So trying to educate your children, my children, grandchildren, to not to rely so heavily on social media is part of the answer. But the other part of it is to think, how can we use social media more creatively to expand their horizons? But as I said, I'm old.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Nye, for all of the insight you just gave. I'm going to call on Adam Powell to do our closing for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. You need to turn my video on. There you go. Our next program will be 1 week from tomorrow, Tuesday, January 14th. We'll host a forum honoring Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. The forum will feature a video of the Secretary accepting a special award and a panel discussion of Secretary Blinken's contributions to the understanding of U.S. policies and society during his 4 years of the Biden administration. This forum will take place online and in person at the George Washington University Elliott School, 1957 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. in room 505. The room's capacity is 50 people. We're taking reservations, but it's first come, first serve. So RSVPs are essential, and you'll want to get yours in very early. Sandwich lunch will be available for in-person guests who arrive by 11:40. You can find the RSVP information on the yesterday's PDCA weekly email update. You can also find it on the PDCA website, which is publicdiplomacy.org, public diplomacy, all one word, .org. Click on events, and then at the bottom of that page, click on announcements, and you'll see it there. We look forward to seeing you next week online or in person. Thank you for joining us.